but you'll see that.
Okay.
Your fee.
And I was telling them before that there are 92 registered, although I don't know who's going to come.
Oh.
Well, it's
Lovely. That's
Still early.
wow.
Hmm.
I guess there's that's really great to hear. Good. You know, there are people all around the world interested in this. It's good. It's a good feeling.
but
You know-
Dutchmen are still in the majority here, eh?
We'll see who comes in.
Yeah.
So welcome for those who are a bit early. Throw into the chat where you're from, if you don't mind. Throw it in for everyone so that we can all see where in the world we're signing in from. Throw it in there as people, I'm going to repeat that a few times, just letting you know, because people continue to come in for the next few minutes. Although we do try to start pretty much on time.
You got some shout outs. There's a hello to Bart.
Hello back. Hi, Joyce.
Portugal, living in Brussels. Okay.
Ella,
As one
good
does.
to have her as well.
Yeah, so you can see we have come around. Yeah. Keep throwing it in, please. And I have to say, I'll show it again, but since we don't have physical copies yet of the book, here is our virtual copy. So we can, that's the cover of it. I'll show it again though. Because I was told you guys don't have it either, Bart. So.
No. We're still in the UK, I think, and Brexit is destroying the moment now.
Yeah, that was part of the conversation.
Another thing to blame Brexit on. That's good.
Yeah. Let's discuss Brexit. The implications of Brexit for Jewish studies.
There you go.
We should attack the United Kingdom to get our books.
You have to send privateer to go and rescue them.
Yeah. Well, we have a good tradition fighting the English as Dutchmen.
Bart, do you have any visuals that you need to try?
No, I don't.
Okay. Just making sure.
Just this, yeah.
Okay, welcome everybody as you're joining in. Please do throw into the chat if you didn't hear me before, throw into the chat where you're signing in from. Looks like we have a nice spread from around the world, so excited that you're coming. Thank you for joining. And people will continue to, from experience, people will continue to join. So, welcome everybody. We'll give everybody 2-3 minutes. Arlington, Massachusetts, Albuquerque. See, we don't only have the complete East Coast. Where are the Dutch?
Where are the Dutch? Where are
Well,
they?
3 of us are here.
That's what I was wondering. Did you mean for people to throw it into the chat? If somebody here has their hand up, if you just put it into the chat, that would be great. Ellie, I see. Ellie, you want to put something into the chat?
Well, any New Yorker is a Dutchman on some level.
Oh.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
You know,
Oh, that's why Ellie raised his hand, is because
yes,
he's Dutch.
Ellie
So
is
sorry,
Dutch.
Ellie.
Ellie, good to see you. Good to see that you're here. Ellie is a neighbor here in Teaneck, New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And a real lover of this history.
Well, Dutch people interested have had the book in Dutch already a few years ago. Eh?
Oh, we have another one. Matt, is another Dutchman.
Hmm.
Probably, yeah, yeah.
I don't know if he's signing in from there or you have to throw in where you're from. I see people are coming. One more minute and then I like to keep it as much on time as possible, but sometimes we give everybody a little bit of a cushion. Oh, there we go. Oh, there's your neighbor.
Oh, maybe.
There's a neighbor from Leiden.
Yeah, well, not all people from Leiden are neighbors, of course.
I know.
But maybe
But
close
of course,
by.
Leiden is that small that you know everyone there, right, Hans?
No, well, almost everyone.
Yeah.
More than 100,000.
How long have you lived there?
In Leiden, I was born there, and I've lived there.
So then you
all my
must know
life.
quite a lot of people there by
I
now.
know a lot of people there, yes, of course. But more than 100,000 is too much for me, anyway.
Yeah.
But I'm sure they will all know you at least.
You never know.
If they don't, they should be ashamed.
You have a shout out, Ronnie, from Yona.
Yes, yes, I saw that. We have a lot of alumni from Leiden. Look at that. Well, it is. Is there rivalry in Holland between the universities? People who graduate from one or the other? Is there a certain?
Yeah, well, I graduated in Leiden University, but I became a professor in Amsterdam. Yeah.
Aha.
Oh, wow. So we're going to start. I'm going to officially welcome everybody. So thank you all for joining us. Also our panelists and also our attendees. This is exciting because we really are branching out outside of the US and we have our actual Dutchman in the Netherlands with us today. And as you all see, our regular logistics, first, please do throw into the chat where you're from. We like to see where we're all calling in from. Second of all, logistics, your microphones and cameras, the attendees' microphones and cameras will be off until after the presentation. At the end of the full presentation, when all three speakers have finished speaking, we will invite you and definitely encourage you to open your microphones and cameras because it makes it a lot more fun and interesting to have a conversation. In the meantime, if there's a pressing issue or if you want to make sure to get it on the books, your question or your comment, please do throw it into the Q&A. And so now to formally welcome everybody on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation, Institute of Jewish Experience, and the Schneier International Program of Yeshiva University. Thank you all for joining us today on the book, recapping the book, Reappraising the History. Oh, I just turned that. That was pretty, I tried. Sorry, I thought I was being so good. Here we go. Reappraising the History of the Jews in the Netherlands. And we are excited. It is actually a translation and a reproduction, and you're going to hear all about what that means and why it's so important and the significance of all of this. So I won't get into all of that, but know that it is an important piece of work, that its time has come, and we're excited to be showcasing it here today. So you didn't come to hear me speak. I will hand it over to Professor Panelist. And if you need anything, throw it into the chat for logistics or Q&A for questions.
Thank you so much, Dora. And this is a real pleasure. One of the great pleasures of working in Sephardic studies is that it complicates and expands your notion of East, West, North, and South. We realize that this is a global history. And when you get to Amsterdam, you realize that it's not only a Sephardic history, it is also a Ashkenazi history. And that's what's really great to have this, a volume like this, and showing the interconnections and the ways that all these pieces connect and inform each other. So as Drora, I want to echo Drora, the point here is the book. So I'm going to briefly introduce the authors and editors and let them guide us through this material. And so I want to welcome Hans Blom, professor of Dutch history at Leiden University, and the director of the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation. Bart Wallet is professor of Jewish history at the University of Amsterdam. And David J. Wertheim is the director of the Menashe Ben Israel Institute for Jewish Social and Cultural Studies in Amsterdam. And they're going to guide us through this foundational and monumental important new history of Dutch Jewry. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us here on New Works Wednesdays. Thank you.
Okay, I will start now.
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to tell something about, as an introduction, about the history of this book. Maybe a small correction beforehand. I'm not a professor of Leiden University. I was a professor in Amsterdam University. I graduated in Leiden University and I live in Leiden, but I was professor and a director of the Institute of War Documentation in Amsterdam. But I'm emeritus now. So that's for a start. Every book has its history, and this book has especially an interesting history in a way. I will go back to the late 70s and the early 80s of the last century. At that moment, there was some work done about the history of the Jews in the Netherlands, but there was no general overview. The last complete general overview was from the 19th century. And before the Second World War, there was an attempt to make a new overview, but in 2 volumes, and only the first volume was published in 1940, but the second volume never came. So there were people working, not that many, but some people working on the history of the Jews in the Netherlands, in the Netherlands itself and also abroad. But at the time, there was certainly the question how to go on. And then in the late 70s, especially in 1980, a first symposium on the Dutch Jewish history was gathered by an initiative of Israeli and Dutch historians. In Israel, Joseph Michman, well known by most of you probably, was the main organizer, and in the Netherlands, my promoter and colleague, the supervisor of my PhD, Ivo Schiffer, was the main driving force behind those conferences for some time. There was a special committee for the history of the Jews in the Netherlands that was part of the Royal Academy of Sciences that was formed in 1980, and the first conference was also organized in 1980 in Amsterdam, and since then, every 3 years, such a conference was held, alternating between in Israel and in the Netherlands, mostly in Amsterdam, but sometimes also in other places. And the proceedings of those conferences were symposia, were published in different ways. Some proceedings in the Studia Rosentaliana. The first Dutch conferences were published in the Studia Rosentaliana. In Israel, the conferences in Israel were a special series. And nowadays, for every conference, a special volume is published with the papers. And that made, together, they make a very, very interesting collection of studies about the history of the Jews in the Netherlands. And during the 80s, in this special committee for the history of the Jews in the Netherlands, the idea was that it became now very urgent to have an overview. And I was a member of that committee later in the 80s. Ivo Schiffer was the chairman, and we decided to try to make a book, a general overview. And Ivo Schiffer was the chairman of that board of editors. He asked me to join him, and also Rena Fuchs Mansveld, who hold the extraordinary chair of Jewish history in Amsterdam University. The 3 of us were the board of editors, and we published in 1995 this book in Dutch, and it was the idea was to have this general overview, not from one hand. The studies were too specialized to find people, someone who could do it all, but we had excellent authors, I should say. They had for Daniel Sierczynski, a great man for the 16th century. We had Josie Kaplan and Jonathan Israel for the Ancien Regime. We had Rena Fuchs, did 2 chapters for the late 18th century and the 19th century. I myself did, together with Joël Cohen, later director of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, the chapter between 1870 and 1940. Peter Romein from the Institute of War Orientation did the Second World War, so the Holocaust study, of course. And Chaya Bras from Israel, from Dutch origin, did the period after the Second World War. And that we produced that book. It was very well received, and that was also translated. The Littman Library was so kind to publish the translation in 2002, I think. And that was also relatively a success, I should say. I think there was a second printing. Also for the Dutch edition, there was a second printing, and there was a paperback edition as well. But in the second decade of the 20th century, the books in the Netherlands anyway were sold out. Also the paperback edition, and the question was whether to publish, to reprint the old edition or to make a new book. My first email, I looked it up, looked for it to the Dutch publisher was from the 13th of June in 2014 to come to what we should do. And then we decided that there was too much change in the historiography for reprinting it without changes, sometimes fundamental changes. And I think that David Wertheim will tell more about that later. But what we decided it was to ask all the authors how they did think about their own chapter. We regretted, of course, that Rena Fuchs and Ivo Schiffer had passed away, so we had to find others for them, of course. And Chaya Bras was, for personal reasons, could not take her own chapter. So we had to find new authors for chapters, and of course, new authors have the right to write a completely new chapter. But the others, Daniel Sierczynski, Joseph Kaplan, and myself, and Peter Romein, were decided to look at the old chapter, but to bring in all the new studies. And most chapters were fundamentally changed, I should say. Maybe at least Jonathan Israel's contribution. He was the master of the field already in the beginning. But we found we found new authors, of course, and I had, of course, because Rena Fuchs and Ivo Schiffer were passed away, I decided that that was not a good idea to do it on my own, and I found what I could call at the time the new bright kids in the block to join me in the board of editors, and David and Wertheim and Bart were indeed young kids. Is of course the wrong, literally the wrong thing to say, because they were established scholars. And I asked Hetty Berg, originally from the Jewish Historical Museum, who was a secretary to the editorial board for the first edition, to join as a full member of the editorial board. She is director of the Judisches Museum in Berlin now, and she had their own contribution to the whole thing. So that is the way we did it, and we published in 2017 this book in Dutch. Completely, I should say, it is a completely new book, although we did not change the title. And that's interesting because when the Littman Library decided that it was worthwhile also to make a translation of this new edition, they thought, and they convinced us that it was better to change the title to make clear that it was not a reprint in the strict sense, but that it is in many respects a really new book, 4 completely new chapters. One, Joshi Kaplan, who was a master in his own field, of course, he completely wrote a new chapter. And we found Irene Zwiep also she's also a very established scholar in the Netherlands for the late 18th century and the early beginning of the 19th century. And Bart wrote 2 chapters at the 19th century, so to say, and the post-war period. And David wrote the new introduction. That was also, of course, important because so many things had changed that we had some shifts in our orientation. In the first edition, the main theme was minority, the Jews as a minority, especially in the Dutch society, but in a way also in the international Jewish community. And that was what more or less brought the things together. And of course, we had to then try at the same time to have a complete overview for all aspects of the history of the Jews in the Netherlands. In my own, the chapter I wrote with Joel Cohen, we decided to give the title Dutch Jews, Jewish Dutch, and Jews in the Netherlands. All that internal differences could give a chance. And but nowadays, well, I think we shifted more to the international relations and the place in, but David will maybe tell more about that. And we had some, so for instance, assimilation is also an important aspect, of course. We changed a little bit the way we phrased that, and the so-called economic turn in Jewish history got attention more than before. So that is more or less the history of this book, and I'm very proud being not a specialist in Jewish history myself. I'm a Dutch historian of the Dutch history of the Netherlands, but I think it is important to have that broader scope as well. But I'm glad that there are now 2 younger editors who will take over. I'm an emeritus and I will pass away at a certain moment, but this book deserves, in my opinion, every few decades, a completely new edition. And so we have to think about a 3rd title for the edition in 2 or 3 decades. That's for the moment from me. Thank you.
Okay, shall I continue then? Maybe we should have as title Reappraising the Reappraising of Dutch Jewish History.
Excellent.
No, I will just go into the topic itself and tell a little bit about Dutch Jewish history. It is and the book, of course, the contents of the book. Dutch Jewish history is a topic on the intersection of many histories: Iberian, German, colonial, Eastern European, and yet it also has its particularity, and it is a history of highs and lows. I would like to say a little bit about the contents of the book, which reveals already something of our idea of the chronology of Dutch Jewish history, its main themes, and also, of course, why Jewish history of the Netherlands is such a fascinating subject. So I hope I can trigger your curiosity, so you all will be willing to learn more about Dutch Jewish history and acquire the book and, of course, read it. Dutch Jewish history actually starts twice. The first chapter of the book by Ben Spade is devoted to the Middle Ages. This is the era of which we know the least. Spade had to work with scattered traces that are left of Jewish presence in Dutch towns and cities, and these are quite scarce. He finds the first traces of Jews only in the 13th century. They show that there were Jewish communities who had to deal, like in the rest of Europe, with anti-Judaism, discrimination, persecutions, and expulsions, although no large-scale expulsions like in France and Spain happened in the Netherlands. Nevertheless, at the end of the 16th century, the Jews seem to have disappeared. But then, Dutch Jewish history starts anew, with its most famous era that begins with the influx of Sephardic Jews who fled for the Inquisition and Ashkenazi Jews who immigrated west for persecutions in Poland and the religious violence of the 30 Years' War. Both came to the Dutch Republic attracted by the freedom of conscience there and the economic prosperity they found there. The Sephardim arrived from the end of the 16th century, the Ashkenazim some 30 years later. Initially, the Sephardic community was the largest and also the most prosperous and prominent. This was the age of famous Dutch Jews like Manasseh ben Israel and Spinoza. They were also much richer than the mostly poor Ashkenazic Jews, but by the end of the 17th century, the communities were equal in size, and after that, the Ashkenazim would be far the largest, and the economic prosperity of the Sephardim would decline. Their freedom in the Dutch Republic had its limitation, but still was quite unique in Europe. Many conversos from the Iberian Peninsula could return and did return to Amsterdam to Judaism. In a time when Catholics were forbidden to have churches, both built grand synagogues. The Ashkenazi synagogue can be seen in the painting on the cover of the book, of the English book, opposite. Opposite of it is the Sephardic synagogue, not on the cover of the English book. It's actually on the, both are on the cover of the Dutch edition. Both were, for its time, enormous buildings that still stand today and attest to the eye-catching presence of the Jewish communities in the Dutch Republic. This is a very important area in Dutch Jewish history when Amsterdam becomes, particularly for the Sephardim, one of the most important Jewish centers in the world. The book devotes, therefore, 3 chapters to this era, written by, as Hans Blom already said, very prominent scholars. One is written by Daniel Swetsinski that focuses on the converso background of the Sephardic Jews, their first arrival and reception. One by Jonathan Israel, who discusses the demography and the economic activities of the early modern Amsterdam Jews, including their colonist endeavors. And one chapter is written by Joseph Kaplan, who has an extensive chapter on the religious, cultural, and social life of both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic communities. These chapters are followed by a chapter written by Irene Zwiep on the years around 1796. That is the year when the revolutionary Batavian Republic that had replaced the Dutch Republic under French military pressure a year before, decreed the civil emancipation of the Dutch Jews. Zwiep investigates to what extent there is really such a rupture in Dutch Jewish history, whether it marked a true revolution or was just an event in a more evolutionary process, and to what extent the call for emancipation and enlightenment came from inside the Jewish community and to what extent from outside forces. Bart Wallet, from whom we will hear later because he is here too, so I will keep this short, then discusses in a chapter on the middle of the 19th century how the Dutch Jews from an autonomous community were centralized and nationalized into the Dutch state. This is followed by Joël Cahen and Hans Blom, who discuss the era from the late 19th century up to the beginning of the Second World War. Hans already said a little bit about this chapter. As in other countries and non-Jewish society, this is a dynamic era full of rapid changes. Dutch Jews took part in many of the processes of modernity, like democratization, industrialization, secularization, and the socialist movement. Jews from the diamond industry were particularly prominent in the budding union movement. Other Jews were prominent liberal politicians. A substantial Jewish press also came to existence in this era, and the era saw the beginning of a very small religious reform movement in the Netherlands. An important other development at the end of this era is the settlement of many refugees from Nazi Germany in the Netherlands. One of the questions asked in this chapter is whether the Dutch Jews shared in the typically Dutch process of pillarization. How did the segregation of Jewish organizational life compare to that of Catholics, Protestants, socialists, and liberals? Dutch Jews managed quite well to settle socially, politically, and culturally in Dutch society in this era. They were relatively successful, although anti-Semitism never disappeared. Moreover, their successful integration in Dutch society is put in perspective with the next chapter on the German occupation. 79% of Dutch Jewry was murdered in the Holocaust. That is more than any other Western European country. Historians have wondered about this Dutch paradox. How could the Nazi persecutions be so successful in a country in which Jews were relatively well integrated? This chapter, written by Peter Romein, summarizes the enormous historiography on this topic and charts the German policies towards the Dutch Jews, their registration, isolation, the anti-Jewish measures, the deportations and murdering, as well as topics such as the functioning of the Jewish Council and the possibilities Jews had of hiding and escaping. And that brings us to the final chapter, also written by Bart T, on how an almost decimated Jewish community dealt with the trauma of war, tried to pick up life, and in certain respects obtained even a central place in Dutch society. But for this, I would like to give the word to Bart himself, who is here.
Thank you, David, and thanks to the organizers for this book launch and discussion. Well, I was privileged to write two chapters. First on the beginning of the 19th century, and second on the post-war history of Dutch Jews. And I'd like to briefly go through these chapters together with you and to point to some decisions I've taken and some new positions I've tried to develop. The first chapter is, you could say, in a sense, the chapter on the beginning of the 19th century, the first one on more or less on the Netherlands as we know it right now. The Netherlands is taking its current political shape, although, of course, still with a significant colonial empire. The colonial empire is integrated into the history of Dutch Jews. And this means that in my chapter, I've tried to include as much as possible, especially on Jews in the West Indies, so in Suriname, in Curacao, and on the other Caribbean islands, as well as the Dutch East Indies. Now, I have to say that there is quite some scholarship right now on Dutch Jews in the Caribbean and Suriname, but research into Jews in the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, is still in its very much in its beginning. So what I'm writing about Jews in the East Indies is tentatively it's really the beginning of a new field, actually. Another aspect is that the history of Dutch Jews in this period includes as well, until 1830, the history of Jews in current-day Belgium. And the Belgian Jewish community, to a large degree, is are daughter communities of the Amsterdam Jewish communities, Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent, Liège. And this fits into a wider theme, since we decided to include not just the Dutch Jews living within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but as well Dutch Jewish diasporas. So Dutch Jews living elsewhere, but bringing with them their Dutch Jewish heritage. So that means the founding of specific Dutch Jewish communities in the beginning of the 19th century in London, for instance. The Sandys Row Synagogue, which is still functioning in London, started as a Dutch Jewish synagogue, adhering to the Amsterdam Ashkenazi minhag. Likewise, several synagogues in the United States started as synagogues of Dutch Jews, still very much attached to their Amsterdam heritage. So defining who we are talking about, Dutch Jews, means the Jews living in the state of the Netherlands, in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, including their diasporas and including the colonial empire. Now, one of the fascinating things that is happening in this period is a redefinition of what it means to be Jewish. Maybe we could even say Dutch Jews redefined themselves from Jews to Israelites, to Dutch Israelites. This terminology, of course, coincides with similar processes in British Jewry, in French Jewry, in German Jewry. The idea being that Israelite is the proper terminology for civilized Jews who define their identity primarily in religious terms. So one could be an Israelite and combine this with being a loyal citizen of the Dutch state. So henceforth, a Dutch Israelite. Now, Dutch Israelite is some sort of buzzword in the 19th century for a lot of Jews, since they interpret and reinterpret this hyphenated identity as bringing together the best of both worlds. On the one hand, they see themselves as adherents to an ancient, respectable, a classical tradition, the Jewish tradition, which is on a par with the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans. And therefore, as Israelites, they should be respected in society. They have a civilization of their own. On the other hand, they are Dutch. And in the 19th century, being Dutch means to adhere to values such as tolerance and le juste milieu, the right middle way, to abhor of extremist positions. Now, Dutch Jews very much take this position as well. It means that as Jews, they will be tolerant Jews because they are Dutch. It means that they don't like extremes. And this translates into a new position as well for Dutch Jewish communities, both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi communities. Since in the 19th century, from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, we witness in a lot of European countries the breakup of Jewish communities into Orthodox communities, into Reformed communities, later on conservative communities, and even in Eastern Europe, there's the more complexing situation of Mitnagdim and Hasidim and Maskilim. Now, Dutch Jews, they look over the borders of their nation state, and they think that both the German Jews and with the invention of Reform Judaism on the one hand, and Eastern European Jews, the Haredim on the other hand, are both extremist positions. So they define themselves as Dutch Jews, as moderate Orthodox. This means as well that they try to keep together the whole community, and at least for the 19th century, they are pretty successful in doing this. So there is no Reform community founded. There are no breakaways on the Orthodox side. Everyone is united in what's called in German an Einheitsgemeinde. But whereas in Germany, this means an Einheitsgemeinde, a Jewish community that gives place to different Jewish streams. In the Netherlands, it means that everyone is nominally part of an Orthodox community with an Orthodox rabbinate. However, that's the other aspect. Whereas the formal identity is Orthodox, both of the Sephardic community and the Ashkenazi community, there's complete freedom for the members. So members can be very free and not participating in Jewish religious life at all and still be a member of the community, whereas other members will be very froom and very active in having an Orthodox lifestyle. All these people are on equal terms members of the community. Within the synagogue service, if they come, they will be treated all alike. They can all, and they were all part of the boards of the communities. They participated in it, and quite often the chairman of the Orthodox nationwide community was not an Orthodox Jew himself, but he defended the right to be an Orthodox community in the Netherlands. And Dutch Jews actually were quite proud of this Dutch Israelite identity they formed. And the fact that they were successful in keeping everyone together. Being Dutch as well means a process of integration into Dutch society. Whereas in the beginning of the 19th century, 90 to 95% was still communicating in Yiddish in the Ashkenazi community. Portuguese was still in use in the Portuguese community. Pretty quick in 1 or 2 generations, the language was changed into Dutch to the degree that at the end of the 19th century, the Western Yiddish that was used in the Netherlands was no longer present, except for a few words and sentences, but no one was actually speaking the language anymore. And the same is very much true for the Portuguese of the Portuguese community. Now, if you go to the last chapter, the one on post-war Jewry, it's precisely this new Dutch Israelite identity that now becomes a problematic identity for a lot of Dutch Jews, since this identity didn't safeguard them during the Second World War. They shared the same fate with German Jews, with French Jews, with Polish Jews and Lithuanian Jews, and so on. A lot of Dutch Jews start expressing their discontent with this Dutch Israelite overarching identity. This results in another redefinition of Dutch Jewish identity in the post-war period, meaning that Dutch Jewry wants to reconnect with world Jewry. And all the developments that are taking place elsewhere in the Jewish world should also translate into developments in the Netherlands. And the interesting aspect is that now we have a very small community, but this small community reflects all the diversity and all the colors of worldwide Jewry, both in religious terms, from ultra-Orthodox to Reconstructionist and everything in between, and in more secular interpretations and more cultural interpretations of Dutch Jewish identity. So this is very much in the post-war period an internal Jewish development. But of course, there's also the position of Jews in society. And in any book on Jewish history, you always have to deal with the bilocation of Jews. On the one hand, being fully part and integrated into a society. On the other hand, fully participating in worldwide or transnational, translocal Jewish structures. That's also very much the case with the Dutch Jews. As for their position in Dutch society, we already heard that pillarization is a topic in Dutch history. After the Second World War, Dutch society was re-pillarized in the late 1940s, the 1950s, until the 1960s. And this meant that the Jewish community, the only possibility to present themselves, to rebuild themselves, was in terms of this re-pillarized organization, meaning as a religious community. So being a Jew means in this period of time, from the perspective of society, a religious community. And it's only through being a religious community that it's possible to participate in society. This is changing in the late 1960s, when Dutch society started to reinvent itself as a multicultural society. And that means that Jews are now re-articulated as a cultural community. And culture becomes a much more important aspect of Jewish identities and in the Netherlands. Whereas in the first period, until the 1960s, Jews were very much in the margins of society. There was a little attention to their plight, their struggles. The community had become tiny. So often people in politics said, we don't need to consult the Jewish community anymore because they are so small. There's no need to address their needs. This all changes from the 1960s onwards. My argument in the chapter is even that Jews are positioned right in the center of Dutch society, meaning that they assume a role of moral authority in public debates, ranging from the Vietnam War to social questions, to foreign policy, questions of solidarity worldwide. Dutch Jews are much appreciated and asked for in the public realm. Now, and this, of course, has everything to do with the heritage of the Second World War and how Dutch society relates to it, as well as to the larger Cold War frame in which Israel is also perceived as being part of the West. So there's a strong solidarity with the Jewish communities, with Israel, and Jews are the moral conscience, or perceived as moral conscience of society. Now, this is changing after 9/11, and in the Netherlands, the Fortuin revolt, another political change in society, due to which Dutch society is discussing its multicultural policies, and a lot of criticism is voiced on this, and there's much stress on how especially immigrant communities should adhere to a newly formulated Dutch Leitkultur, an overarching framework of Dutch cultural identity, which is mostly a very liberal definition, almost Spinozist definition of individual freedoms. Now, collective religious communities, such as Muslim communities, but also religious Jewish communities, are now sometimes at odds with public morality. So here we see that the position of Dutch Jews after 2000 becomes much more ambivalent. On the one hand, especially with relation to the Second World War, their position is still quite prominent, but in other respects, especially when we are discussing religious topics or the position of the State of Israel, Dutch Jews are going back to the margins, as I formulated in the chapter. That leaves us, in the end, my conclusion is that Dutch Jewry started still very much as a more or less cohesive community after the war, but has now developed into 52,000 privatized and individualized Judaisms in a much more complex society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Definitely, I'll let Professor Perlis sum it up while I invite everyone, please, to open your cameras and your microphones and share. Please do open so we can see who we're talking to and we can share some information. So open your cameras and then ask to open your microphone, please. Professor Perlis.
I'll just say that the presentation was very illuminating and gives you a sense of the book and the story behind the book. This is, an area of very rich scholarship, as anyone who spent any time here knows. And some really some of the great historians working in Jewish history have been involved in this project. Many of whom have their hands in other fields as well and come into this. So it's really great. And that last analysis about the last, I guess, about 100 or so years of Dutch Jewry, I think also gives people who aren't familiar with the intricacies and the subtleties of that community, gives you a better sense of why it's worthwhile going deep, because there's things, sometimes when you study a community that's not like yours, you see things about your own that make a lot more sense, or you realize, whoa, it didn't have to be this way. It could have been this way. And by comparing and by understanding the inner dynamics, I think that's a really useful exercise. So without any further ado, I know there are questions. We have a lot of people. Also, a sign of a good presentation is that close to the end of the allotted time, there's still many people here. So I want to turn it over to them. And if you send questions to chat, that's great. If you want to, right, Dora, they can unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you're promoted to panelist, you can unmute. So please do. I know Carolyn had a question.
Yeah, my interest is not in the period that you majorly discussed. I did get to look at the inside feature of Amazon and looked at the table of contents, the introduction, and the illustrations, and that led me to learn just a few things already. I ordered the book. My center of interest had been Recife and the Dutch colony in Recife, particularly in the art. It was a graduate art history course that I took on a sabbatical. And I ended up not realizing that there was such a huge Jewish community there until halfway through my research, because my professor had no idea. And there are little tidbits that I thank you, because I never knew about the publishing of Manasseh ben Israel, which I saw so I could read more about later. And the artist is not Jewish, Zacharias Wagner, with the slave picture. I have more questions about the involvement of Jews in the slave trade. And I don't know if you can address this, because obviously your expertise is in a later period. In the introduction, it says Jews were slave traders. Were they allowed to own land in Recife, and were they slave owners in Recife? Do you know?
Shall I take it, David, Hans? But this is really one of the debates that we are discussing right now, and a lot of new scholarship is coming to the fore lately. There's a great new book by Aviva Ben-Ur on a Jewish autonomy in a slave society on Jews in Suriname, and in the case of Suriname, Jews were both trading enslaved people and having them on their plantations, but also converting some of them to Judaism, just founding actually or resulting in the founding of a Euro-African Jewish sub-community in Suriname. Now, as for Dutch Brazil, there's definitely a lot of evidence of the existence of enslaved people there as well, also with the Portuguese Jews, and some of them even returned to Amsterdam after the fall of Dutch Brazil to the Portuguese. They returned to Amsterdam, taking with them several people. But in the Netherlands, slavery was forbidden, so they became their servants. But I assume their role didn't change that much.
Were they involved in owning plantations in Recife, or were they just merchants? Yeah, they did, and therefore they would have slaves as plantation owners. I discovered in a synagogue in Louisiana, I had a tour of the synagogue, and the woman who conducted the tour said that her ancestors were slave owners in sugar plantations in Louisiana. So I knew that. I knew about Suriname too, but I was wondering about Recife.
Well, maybe, hopefully I see Aviva's on our Zoom here. I do want to have you back with your new book. I have ordered it, haven't read it yet. So we're doing a promo now for Aviva too. If you could join us back on a New Works Wednesday. In the meantime, Yitzhak, you have a question or comment?
I noticed that you're doing Morocco.
I just want to go to Yitzhak first so he has a chance. But he's not.
Yeah, congratulations to all the authors and participants. It's a monumental effort. What about not necessarily the colonies, but what about the periphery? What about more micro history? Also, what has changed in terms of researching women in the historiography in the last 20 years, 30 years? But primarily in the periphery, because you focus obviously on the big city, Amsterdam, but what about in a number of other places, even Rotterdam or Groningen, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, maybe on the topic of women, Hans may say something, since in his chapter this plays really a role. Let me say something about the countryside or the other cities outside of Amsterdam. Most of the times, the Amsterdam community is some 50% of all Dutch Jews. Which means that the other 50% is spread all over the country. Now, especially in the beginning of the 19th century, after the emancipation, Jews are allowed to settle everywhere in the country. Well, they are doing that. So to the tiniest places, we have Jewish communities, synagogues. Now, these are all they are formalized as Jewish communities within the framework of the Dutch Israelite denomination. I saw Eli Schaap writing about one of his ancestors being a Chazan Rebbe Shauchet somewhere on the countryside. Well, that's very much the case. There were a few rabbis in the large communities, but mostly it were these Chazanim, little people, not too much background often, very problematic situations as well between the board of Jewish communities on the one hand, who didn't pay much, so they often had to look as well for different sources of income, really difficult positions, but they were the ones upholding Jewish life throughout the country. Absolutely.
Holly?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. I wanted to thank Bart and David and Hans for the book very, very much. Thank you for the webinar. And I wanted to ask you, what is the current population of the Jews in Netherlands now?
Well, probably Bart knows better, but I think about 50,000. It's how you count a little bit. It's always difficult.
Depends on your definition.
Exactly who is a Jew, but not everyone knows that. But we normally think about 50,000, Bart.
Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah.
52,000 if you include what in Dutch is called father Jews, so only patrilineal Jews. If you use the halachic definition, it's 37,000.
Yeah. Well, Netherlands is a small country, and
Absolutely.
Well, it's
Yeah,
very small.
yeah.
It's very small. It was all during the whole history. It was a very small community. Never
Yeah.
more than 2% of the Dutch population was registered as Jewish. So it was small all the time, but it's still even much more small than it was, of course. And we know all the reason for that.
And forgive me,
But
I
it-
have to laugh at myself. I thought Leiden, or if I'm pronouncing it right, Leiden, I thought it was in Germany. I apologize.
And Hans, I
I've
think I
been in-
cut you off before that you were going to say something.
Yeah,
sorry,
well,
Hans.
2 things. I've been in
No,
Amsterdam.
wait, Carolyn, Hans,
Okay,
was,
I'm
I think
sorry.
I cut off
I
Hans.
can't tell
before.
what's going on here. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Hold on. Did I cut you off before, Hans? Were you about to say something?
Well, maybe I could say a few words about women in
sorry.
my chapter. But we, compared to the first edition, we had a much bigger paragraph about women in the period 1870 to 1940. And it's very interesting that on the one hand, of course, as Bart said already, women played in the religious communities, especially, and in the more cultural Jewish circles, the important role of keeping the tradition and translating the tradition to the modern times. On the other hand, a remarkable number of Jewish women from Jewish descent, played an important role in the Dutch feminist organizations. The most important, the most famous feminist, Aletta Jacobs, that's a very interesting case also about the position of Jewish community in the Netherlands. She was by Jewish descent. She was the first woman that had a university degree, and she was a very important, also international feminist. But she never publicly spoke about that. No, for a long time, nobody knew that she was Jewish. That was for some people some kind of a shocking thing, and that tells an interesting story, and it tells in the first place that it was maybe also in Dutch society in certain situations better not to admit that you are Jewish. So there is an undertone of anti-Semitism also in the Netherlands. All the toleration accepted, it was always there. And on the other hand, it is the intriguing question what this radicalization, she was a very secularized person, that this kind of radicalization in Jewish circles that maybe contributed to taking radical positions in other surroundings as well. So there is a lot of more work to do about this. And Aletta Jacob was not the only example, but she was probably the most extreme in not talking about it. For most of the other feminists, Jewish feminists, people knew about it. That's so far for now.
Ron, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all the professors and the hosts for a fascinating presentation. I can't wait to buy and read the book.
There we are.
Professor Wallet mentioned that there were Dutch Jewish communities in London and in the United States a while ago. And I just wondered whether there were still active Dutch Jewish communities in London, the United States, and elsewhere, or whether they had essentially assimilated into the local communities.
Yeah, well, of course, it depends a bit on how you define Dutch communities. Since from the early modern period, of course, there are there's the Western Sephardic diaspora, in which for a very long time Amsterdam took a prominent position. even until the late 20th century or the beginning even of the 21st century, the Chazan of She'erit Israel, the Sephardic community in New York, was trained in Amsterdam still at Eitz Chaim. And I think he is the very last, but you can see how at least the Western Sephardic diaspora for a very long time relied on Amsterdam for providing chazanim, melamedim, rabbis, officials. I've been looking into this for the 19th century, that communities in the Caribbean, but also in Latin America, they wrote letters, and also the United States, they wrote letters to Amsterdam. Please send us a new chazan. We need someone. And well, yeah, you have to turn to Eitz Chaim. That's the place to be. In Amsterdam, they train these people according to the Portuguese traditions. Now, for the Ashkenazi communities, this is mostly a process that starts in the 19th century. The Ashkenazi community in London formally still exists. Sandy's Rose synagogue. It's even the oldest functioning Ashkenazi synagogue in London right now. And still, if you enter the synagogue, it's partly painted in orange, the Dutch national color. And like the elder families are very proud of their Dutch heritage over there. On the other hand, if you ask if are they still keeping the Minhag Amsterdam, and are they still turning to Amsterdam as Beit Din? No, they have assimilated into London Jewry in that sense, and it's some sort of nostalgia for some families. That's it. And it's very much the same for communities in New York, in Boston, in Montreal, in Canada. These communities started as Dutch communities with very strong links to Dutch communities as well, and having their rabbis from Amsterdam. But nowadays, if they still exist, they've become a part of regular Orthodox or conservative streams. I think the only thing that still exists is in New York, a Dutch Israelite burial society. So they have still a plot where if you're a member, you can be buried there. So maybe that's as well a bit ironic that that's the last trace of the Dutch diaspora community.
Are you okay?
I am absolutely floored at the depth of this book and all of the scholarship that went into it. And I thank you very much for creating.
Thank you, Carolyn. I just want to know if we can do one more question. Is that okay? Ellie had one more question or comment or.
Yeah, thank you again very much for this book. I'm looking forward to receiving it when it comes out. I think it would be interesting. I would love to hear more about, like Hans Blom, what you were talking about, Aletta Jacobs hiding her Jewishness, but there is a general part of Dutch culture for many centuries of being extremely reserved about the psychology of people, what was really and through psychological insights, looking back at history of what was happening, like the most obvious one was post-Holocaust of people not being willing to talk about what happened. But I find that, like, I have from 1628, I have a Menashe ben Israel edition of the prayers in Portuguese for the 5 fast days, the minor fast days and Tisha B'Av during the year. And there's even no Hebrew in it because the people wanted, it's one of his first books that he published. So it showed that people were dealing with trauma, and the religious response to trauma was to make fast days a major importance. In the Ashkenazi tradition, you don't have any of these books that are just about the fast days. And certainly they would have Hebrew and maybe an English or a Ladino translation, but they would not be exclusively in Portuguese. So you could do a history of the motivations of what made people speak out, or mostly not speak out, about what was going on in the inner psyche in relationship to Dutch history in general and in relationship to Jewish history. So I was just curious if you have been thinking about that, or if people are starting to publish that.
Everyone, very good. But it's an interesting point you raised.
Maybe to like from a book, we start talking about another book. Another book just published is called Ego Documents in Dutch Jewish History. And the term ego documents is coined by a Dutch Jewish historian, Jacques Presser. These are like autobiographical documents. And this volume tried to bring together from early modern period up until today studies on well the inner world, so to say, as reflected in these ego documents. So maybe that's a good book for you to start with. And it's interesting if you start looking into this, how many personal documents are left, not only by the big people, by the rabbis, by the Spinozas, by the philosophers, but as well in Yiddish or in ordinary Dutch by much more ordinary Jews. And I've been working on an 18th century Yiddish chronicle, and this was quite an ordinary person living in the Amsterdam Jewish neighborhood who wanted to document what was taking place in the neighborhood, and he was and he also wrote about his own perceptions of this.
So I'm trying to look up that book. Sounds fascinating. When is it? Because I see that there was a conference at Bar Ilan on the topic. On the web, Ego Documents in Dutch Jewish History. That will be the title of the book. Who's the editor or the
it's edited by Dan Michman of Bar Ilan. The conference was at Hebrew U.
Okay.
It's published, I think, last week. So it's
wow.
very
wonderful. That's great. What a gift. Great. Thank you.
So I think that's a good place to end, if that works for everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much to our presenters. I think everybody feels enriched after this presentation. I think everybody wants to learn more, which is always a good sign, because when people are thirsty for more, then you did something right. Because if you're answering all the questions, it's just not worth it. So thank you, everyone. And I wish everyone around the world a great rest of your day. And looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks at the next one.
Thank you, everybody. Stay well.
Bye.
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 Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I think I will leave now.
Yeah, you can leave as you want. I turn off my camera.
Okay.
So I can leave.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Have a good evening.